welcome back to our second video. As I indicated, we'd also get to spend some time where I'd introduce, the simple science, I guess, of our brains under stress and under pressure. So in a moment, I'm going to talk through the basics of this. This is what's called the Triune Brain, kind of the three main sections of our brain. And I'll talk through that as it relates to our emotional intelligence and our stress response. And before I do that, I just want to share with you that as I think about kind of the connections of the content items that you've all experienced, really this piece is about kind of that intersection of where we first need to have some level of personal mastery, right? So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the personal mastery aspect, or our own ability to be aware of our stress response, which is just my own self-work, right? And then our ability to manage that in relationships with others. So to be able to do both of those, first it helps to, I think, understand more of how our brains operate. What does the science show? And some of you might be more familiar with this than others, because this has been scientific research that's been emerging for many, many years, and certainly a lot that came out of what they call the decade of the brain, kind of in the early 90s, where really folks were looking at how do we operate? What's the science of the brain? And the Triune Brain talks about the science of the brain under stress and pressure. So you can think about it from this perspective, right? That we all are familiar with this. We know that we have sort of at the very basics, the base level, literally the base of the brain, and from a human evolution standpoint, the very basics of how our brains were developed and what we accessed most of the time, especially back in the days of hunting and gathering, and even some years beyond that, is what's called the reptile brain. It's called the reptile brain because it was the first and foremost section of the brain developed. And for many, many, many moons of our human evolution, that's really all we needed to worry about, is to eat and not be eaten, right? And it's sort of right, as we know of this portion of the brain, it's the fight, flight, or freeze portion of the brain. So what's, I think, most interesting to me about that part of the brain science is that it is actually not until somewhat recently, several hundreds of years recently, that these other portions of the brain became more and more developed. That actually, this portion of the brain still has a tendency to pull us into it, right? Because that's what we accessed for the most part of our human evolution. So, reptile brain, just don't kill me, don't stress me out, don't cut me off in traffic, don't call me out in a meeting, don't tell me you're not listening to me, don't correct how I load the dishwasher, right? These are the things that that's a quick go-to for us. We are quickly sent into reptile brain, and any of those more what we call kind of modern-day saber-toothed tigers, as it were, are modern-day stress, kind of stress incidences. Right. I know, of course, that some of us have jobs that are, much higher modern-day incidences of stress, where, those of you in military, paramilitary, police, fire, those types of lines of work, right? People literally are sent into this portion of their brain. So then we have the second portion that was more developed as we evolved, and that's the emotional brain. Right? And what's interesting about that is that it wasn't something that was accessed a whole lot. We didn't have to, initially in our human survival, really need to remember a whole lot more than how to use a basic tool, right? But as relationships became more complex, and our tools and systems became more complex, and our societies and the way we interacted became more complex, so too did the mammalian portion of the brain and our emotional brain. We started to have more life experiences and more things to remember, right? And so there's a really powerful connection between reptile brain and emotional brain, right? When something both joyful happens for us or highly stressful happens for us, that gets stored as data in our brains. But what's most, I think, significant about the scientific research, and we know this, is that we have actually a rather small capacity to bring to our conscious awareness, to remember most of the things that have occurred for us. So our brains store the data, but it's not in our conscious memory. And that's really also sort of the science of our defense mechanisms. And anybody who's done work with folks who have suffer from PTSD, it's similarly linked, right? We know that post-traumatic stress disorder really is connected to something that has occurred, and we had to kind of go into fight or flight. We stored that memory, but we don't have conscious connection to it. So it sort of hangs out there, it kind of lurks in the shadows, and then it sort of rears its head when maybe we're doing something in the third portion of our brain, which is called the neocortex, right? That's where we're, responsible for logic and decision making, and the times when we're in our sometimes we say our right minds, right? So this is where most of us are most of the time, and I would imagine you're probably there right now, right? Watching a video, hopefully you have some yummy beverage and you're relaxing, right? So you're just able to kind of think and soak it in, and hopefully nothing too stressful is going on right now. But what happens, what the science and the science of emotional intelligence, which is often attributed to work by a gentleman named Daniel Goleman and some of his predecessors, Savoy and Mayer, what the work really shows is that these three portions of the brain somewhat operate a little bit distinctly from each other. And so our goal and our role in interpersonal mastery is to become more skillful at, number one, being aware of what is our stress response, and actually bringing some things to our conscious awareness just more daily about what does cause us stress. Where do we get kind of in angst or defensiveness with other people? And what is a healthier way to manage that instead of just getting what Goleman calls hijacked to reptile brain, right? So if you remember from my first video, I was talking about myself and how I arrived at work a little bit stressed after traffic and weather, and kind of had a little bit of a tense moment with my coworker when I interpreted the way she looked at me as a little judgy. And I was right, so I responded in a tart way, and what I noticed is then I quickly was able to kind of pause that and get myself back here. I'm stressed, my apologies. But what's funny is I was still kind of vibrating a little this morning, and my other colleague came in and started to share this whole list of things that I did not know that we were responsible for a project we're working on. And so even though I had just kind of gotten myself back here, as soon as he started to share this list of things that we need to do, boom, I was back in fight, flight, or freeze. And I remember again having not the most interpersonal mastery-like response. It was something like, holy, and then I said another word, right, about how much we were expected to do, and it was, how quickly I went back to fight, flight, or freeze, because I was already kind of there. So that is probably a dynamic that most of us are familiar with, right? It's not that we have no wherewithal about how to manage our stress, right? Everybody, I'm sure, who's watching this video, we've all been in those. But what I think is so significant about paying attention to the science, and it has helped me significantly, is that this is actually a tool I use every day. Because I can really ask myself, was that a fight, flight, or freeze response? And what was the impact on relationships of that? And what's it going to take for me to kind of get back to a more healthy, rational, kind of calculated response? And a big piece of that is around emotional management, right? A big piece of interpersonal mastery then is being able to notice how much this dynamic comes into play. When I'm feeling stressed, when I feel put upon, when I feel overwhelmed, right? This is the impact on me. So going to be in the last video here in a moment, just talking about what are some of then our responsibilities as individuals and obviously as leaders in terms of paying attention to the statistics we already talked about, being more skillful at managing our neuroscience, often called the neuroscience of leadership, and where does the kind of the rubber meet the road, as it were. So much like what Eric was talking with you guys about in an earlier video, sort of that intersection of how do we not just be effective, right? I could get through the meeting just fine, right? I was fine getting through the meeting. I took down the data, right? Effective, maybe efficient, right? We only had 20 minutes by the time I showed up, so we had a lot to crank through. So I could be effective and efficient. But in terms of overall satisfaction, right, I was impacting my colleagues in a funky way, and sure enough, as soon as I had kind of a tart response, a little bit of a tart one came back. One of my colleagues looked at me and said, is there a problem? And I don't know if anybody's ever said that to one of you guys, but I can say, given that I was already here, when they asked me if there was a problem, there was a problem, right? Like I was frustrated. And so I feel like that's a lovely example. It wasn't quite like that, but I think my colleague was just checking in, right? I interpreted it in this very rude way. I think it was actually a legitimate check-in. Like, hey, is everything okay? But in my reptile mind, right? So I just had this really unpleasant impact on my colleagues based on sort of my lack of willingness to manage my neuroscience just this morning. So I'll ask you to kind of pause at that and know that we'll come back and do one more quick video just to give you some things to think about between now and our session in September.